The ambitious lazy paradox. A strange contradiction exists within certain people. They carry genuine ambition inside them, a real hunger for achievement, and a deep belief that they are meant for something significant. Yet they cannot seem to make themselves act on any of it. These individuals are not lazy in the traditional sense, because lazy people do not dream of greatness. They are not unmotivated because unmotivated people feel no frustration at their stagnation. The ambitious lazy person experiences both the pull toward achievement and the weight of chronic inaction. And this internal contradiction becomes a source of constant suffering. This psychological profile is far more common than anyone admits openly. The ambitious lazy individual typically possesses above-average intelligence and genuine creative capacity. They can articulate exactly what they want to accomplish and often develop detailed plans for getting there. Their minds generate ideas constantly, sometimes so many ideas that the sheer volume becomes overwhelming. What separates them from successful people is not vision or capability, but the mysterious inability to translate intention into sustained effort. Society generally treats ambition and laziness as mutually exclusive categories. You are either a driven person who gets things done, or you are an idle person who wastes potential. But human psychology is more complicated than these simple categories allow. Two opposing forces can occupy the same mind, creating a tug-of-war that leaves the person exhausted without having accomplished anything. The ambitious lazy person knows exactly what they should be doing and still cannot bring themselves to do it, which makes their situation feel uniquely hopeless. The purpose of understanding this paradox is not to create another label or excuse. Labels do not solve problems and excuses prevent growth. The purpose is to identify the specific psychological mechanisms that create this pattern so those mechanisms can be addressed directly. The ambitious lazy condition is not a permanent personality trait stamped into someone at birth. It is a collection of mental habits, emotional patterns, and neurological tendencies that formed through specific circumstances. These patterns respond to intervention, but only when you stop attacking yourself with vague accusations and start examining the actual mechanics underneath. The brain's tug-of-war, the conflict between ambition and inaction, is not abstract or metaphorical. It occurs in actual brain structures that compete for dominance every time you face a difficult task. The prefrontal cortex handles planning, future thinking, and impulse regulation. This is where your ambition resides, where you construct visions of success and map out the steps required to achieve them. Working against it is the limbic system. It's an older and faster part of the brain that processes emotion. It detects threats and prioritizes immediate comfort over distant rewards. When an ambitious, lazy person considers working on something challenging, the limbic system responds before the prefrontal cortex can finish its argument. The brain interprets effort as a cost, uncertainty as a risk, and potential failure as something to flee from rather than face. The limbic system does not distinguish between a lion in the grass and the discomfort of starting a difficult project. Both represent threats to your current state, and the limbic system exists to maintain that state at all costs. Dopamine complicates this battle further. This neurotransmitter drives motivation and reward-seeking behavior, but it responds more strongly to immediate pleasures than to delayed outcomes. When you abandon a challenging task and reach for entertainment instead, your neurochemistry reinforces that choice by reducing the discomfort immediately. The unpleasant feeling vanishes temporarily, and your brain records an important lesson about escaping demanding situations. Repetition strengthens this pathway until avoidance becomes the automatic response to anything requiring sustained effort. The ambitious lazy person is not fighting a character defect, but a neurological setup that favors short-term relief over long-term gain. Their prefrontal cortex generates big goals while their limbic system vetoes the effort required to pursue them. This explains why they can spend hours planning and researching and envisioning success without ever taking concrete action. The planning feels productive because it activates reward, centers without triggering the threat response that actual work produces. Perfectionism as disguised fear. Many ambitiously see people identify as perfectionists, wearing the label almost proudly. They believe their inability to start projects stems from high standards rather than avoidance. They tell themselves they cannot begin until everything aligns properly, until they feel completely prepared and circumstances cooperate fully. But perfectionism in this context is not about quality at all. It functions as a sophisticated defense mechanism that allows intelligent people to avoid action while maintaining a positive self-image. The psychology behind this pattern reveals something uncomfortable. Perfectionism and fear of failure share the same root system. The person who refuses to start until conditions are ideal is actually refusing to start until failure becomes impossible, since failure is always possible in any worthwhile endeavor. The perfectionist has created an unwinnable situation that guarantees permanent inaction. They have built an elegant psychological trap and locked themselves inside it. Consider the graduate student who has been researching their thesis topic for 3 years but has not written a single chapter. They know more about their subject than almost anyone else in their department. Yet they insist they need more information before they can begin writing. Or consider the entrepreneur who has filled 17 notebooks with business ideas, but has never registered a single company or made a single sale. They are waiting for the perfect concept, the one that cannot fail, which means they will wait forever. The ambitious lazy person uses perfectionism to protect something fragile inside themselves. As long as they never truly attempt something, they never have to confront the possibility that their abilities might not match their self-perception. Staying in preparation mode indefinitely preserves the fantasy of unlimited potential. The tragedy is that unlimited potential means nothing if it remains permanently untested. A beautifully imagined future that never meets reality is just an elaborate form of self-deception that becomes harder to maintain with each passing year. The comfort of potential there is a psychological payoff to remaining in a state of unrealized potential. Right. And the ambitious lazy person has discovered it intuitively. When you have not yet attempted something seriously, you exist in a space of infinite possibility. You might be brilliant. You might be exceptional. You might accomplish everything you envision and more. The moment you actually try, that comfortable ambiguity collapses into concrete results that can be measured and judged. This is why the ambitious lazy person often feels more attached to their ideas than to any process of execution. The idea in its pure form is perfect and untouchable. A business concept sitting in a notebook cannot go bankrupt. A novel outlined in meticulous detail cannot receive harsh reviews. A fitness goal that exists only as intention cannot result in visible failure at the gym. The potential version of success carries none of the risks that actual pursuit involves. Psychologists describe this as protecting the ego through strategic ambiguity. By never committing fully to an outcome, you maintain plausible deniability about your capabilities. If someone asks why you have not achieved your goals, you can always point to circumstances, timing, or priorities rather than ability. The ambitious lazy person becomes skilled at constructing these explanations, often believing them sincerely, while some deeper part recognizes the evasion. The comfort of potential comes with a hidden cost that compounds over time. Each year spent in possibility rather than action makes the transition harder. The gap between where you are and where you imagine yourself widens until it feels unbridgeable. Meanwhile, watching peers take imperfect action and achieve imperfect results creates a painful contrast that the ambitious lazy person must rationalize away. They tell themselves that those people settled, that they lack vision, that their success is somehow lesser. These stories become necessary to preserve the belief that staying in potential was the right choice all along. Why motivation fails? The ambitious lazy person often believes their core problem is insufficient motivation. They think that successful people possess some internal fire that burns constantly, propelling them forward without effort. If only they could find the right inspiration, the right speaker, the right book, everything would finally click into place. This belief keeps them consuming endless content about productivity and success while producing nothing themselves. Motivation is an emotion, and emotions are unreliable foundations for sustained effort. They fluctuate based on sleep quality, blood sugar levels, weather, and countless other variables outside your control. The person waiting to feel motivated before they act has made their progress dependent on conditions they cannot manufacture. They wake up some mornings with energy and enthusiasm, accomplish a burst of activity, then lose momentum as soon as the feeling fades. This inconsistency reinforces the belief that something is fundamentally wrong with them. What distinguishes people who execute from people who stagnate is not superior motivation, but the willingness to work without it. The professional writer sits down at the keyboard whether inspiration visits or not. The successful athlete trains on days when their body begs for rest. These people have decoupled action from feeling, understanding that waiting for the right emotional state is just another form of procrastination. It's wearing a reasonable disguise. The ambitiously Z person has often developed extensive knowledge about achievement without developing the capacity for it. They can explain productivity systems in detail, debate the merits of different goal-setting frameworks, and quote successful people at length. This knowledge creates an illusion of progress because learning feels like doing. But information without application changes nothing in your actual life. You can understand exactly how discipline works while remaining completely undisciplined. The gap between knowing and doing is where ambitiously Z people spend most of their lives, accumulating insights they never convert into outcomes and wondering why understanding the problem has not solved it. Environment over willpower. The ambitious lazy person tends to frame their struggle as a willpower problem. They believe they simply lack the mental strength to resist distraction and push through discomfort. But willpower functions more like a battery than a muscle, and it drains quickly when your environment constantly demands self-controlled decisions. Every notification you resist, every temptation you fight, every distraction you ignore depletes the same limited reserve of mental energy. Researchers have found that the physical presence of a smartphone reduces cognitive capacity, even when the phone is face down and silent. The brain expends resources monitoring the device, anticipating its interruptions, and suppressing the urge to check it. Multiply this by every potential distraction in your workspace, and you begin to understand why willpower alone rarely succeeds. The ambitious lazy person is not weaker than others, but is often operating in environments designed to hijack attention at every opportunity. People who consistently execute on their goals have learned to design environments that make productive action the path of least resistance. They remove friction from desired behaviors and add friction to undesirable ones. A writer who struggles with distraction might use a separate computer with no internet connection for drafting. A person trying to eat better might stop keeping certain foods in their home entirely rather than relying on daily resistance. These are not signs of weakness, but acknowledgments of how human attention actually operates. The concept extends beyond physical spaces into digital and social environments as well. The applications on your phone home screen, the people you spend time with, the media you consume regularly all shape what feels normal and what feels difficult. An ambitiously Z person surrounded by other ambitiously Z people will find their patterns, constantly reinforced through shared complaints and mutual validation of inaction. Changing your social environment. To include people who actually execute on their goals creates subtle pressure that works in your favor rather than against it. The ambitious lazy person can apply this principle immediately by auditing their workspace and digital environment. Which objects invite distraction and which support focus? Which applications generate interruptions that fragment concentration? Which physical arrangements make starting work easier or harder? Small adjustments accumulate into significant changes over time. Keeping your phone physically distant during focused work sessions is not a dramatic intervention, but studies suggest it measurably improves cognitive performance. Logging out of social media platforms, so access requires extra steps, creates just enough friction to interrupt automatic checking behaviors. Environment design replaces daily willpower. Battles with one-time structural decisions that continue working even when your motivation disappears completely. Small acts, rewired brain. The ambitious lazy person often thinks in dramatic terms. They imagine transformation as a sudden shift, a moment when everything changes and discipline becomes effortless. This thinking produces grand plans and ambitious schedules that collapse within days because the gap between current behavior and intended behavior is simply too large to bridge in one leap. Neuroscience suggests a different approach. The brain changes through repetition, not through intensity. Neural pathways strengthen when actions are performed consistently over time, regardless of how small those actions might be. A person who writes for 10 minutes every single day for a year will develop stronger writing habits than someone who writes for 8 hours once a month. The brain does not care about the impressiveness of individual efforts, but about the frequency with which certain behaviors occur. This principle directly addresses the ambitious lazy pattern because it removes the need for motivation or willpower to be present in large quantities. Doing something small requires minimal activation energy. The resistance that normally prevents action barely registers when the task seems insignificant. Yet each completion sends a signal to the brain that this behavior belongs in your routine, that you are the type of person who does this thing regularly. The ambitiously lazy person can exploit this mechanism by selecting actions so minimal they feel almost pointless, reading one page instead of a chapter, exercising for 5 minutes instead of an hour, spending a short focused session on a project instead of waiting for a free afternoon. These tiny commitments bypass the threat response that larger commitments trigger, allowing action to occur without the usual internal battle. There is a compounding effect that makes this approach particularly powerful over time. Each small action completed builds evidence that contradicts the ambitious lazy identity. The person begins to see themselves differently, not through affirmations or positive thinking, but through accumulated proof of behavior change. A single completed task means little, but hundreds of them assembled over months create an undeniable pattern that reshapes self-perception at a fundamental level. Over weeks and months, something shifts beneath conscious awareness. The behavior that once required deliberate effort begins to automatic automatic. The neural pathway has strengthened enough that initiation becomes easier. And the person often naturally extends beyond their minimal commitment, because starting was the hardest part. The ambitious lazy person does not need to become a different person overnight, but simply needs to accumulate enough small actions that their brain updates its definition of who they are. Identity follows behavior more reliably than behavior follows identity, which means acting like a disciplined person eventually makes you one. The return. Self-compassion without excuses. The ambitious lazy person lives with a constant internal critic that punishes them for every failure to act. They lie awake, cataloging wasted time, replaying moments of weakness, and constructing elaborate plans for how they will behave differently starting in the morning. This self-punishment feels productive because it demonstrates awareness of the problem. But research consistently shows that harsh self-criticism does not motivate change. It creates shame, and shame drives avoidance, which deepens the very pattern the person desperately wants to escape. Self-compassion offers a different approach, though it requires careful definition. This is not about letting yourself off the hook or accepting mediocrity as inevitable. Self-compassion means responding to setbacks the way you would respond to a friend struggling with the same challenge. It means acknowledging failure without catastrophizing it, recognizing that imperfect progress still constitutes progress, and refusing to let a single bad day justify abandoning the entire effort. The distinction between self-compassion and excuse-making lies in what happens next. The person making excuses uses their failure as evidence that change is impossible and returns to old patterns indefinitely. The person practicing self-compassion acknowledges the failure, examines what contributed to it, adjusts their approach if necessary, and resumes action as quickly as possible. One response leads to stagnation, while the other leads to resilience. Ambitiously lazy people often swing between extremes of harsh discipline and complete collapse. They attack themselves with rigid expectations, fail to meet those expectations, spiral into self-criticism, abandon all structure and response, then eventually restart the cycle with even harsher expectations. This oscillation exhausts them without producing lasting change. Sustainable transformation requires holding two truths simultaneously. You are responsible for your actions and their consequences. You are also human, imperfect, and guaranteed to fail repeatedly on the path to any meaningful accomplishment. These truths do not contradict each other. Accepting both allows you to maintain forward momentum even when individual days go poorly, which over time matters far more than any single success or failure. The ambitious lazy person must also learn to separate their identity from their behavior on any given day. A missed workout does not make you a failure. A day spent avoiding important work does not erase the progress you made yesterday, and setbacks become identity statements rather than isolated events. Recovery becomes exponentially harder because you must rebuild your entire self-concept before you can resume action. Treating failures as data points rather than verdicts preserves the psychological stability needed to continue showing up even when performance fluctuates, which it always will, regardless of how disciplined you eventually become. From dreamer to doer, the distance between dreaming and doing is not as vast as it feels. It is not a canyon requiring a miraculous leap, but a series of small gaps that can be crossed one at a time with ordinary effort. Everything discussed in the previous chapters points toward a single uncomfortable truth that the ambitiously sleazy person must eventually accept. No amount of understanding substitutes for action, and no amount of planning produces results without execution. You now understand why your brain resists effort and seeks immediate comfort. You recognize how perfectionism operates as fear wearing a sophisticated mask. You see the trap of unlimited potential and the failure of motivation as a reliable fuel source. You know that environment shapes behavior more powerfully than willpower, and that small, consistent actions rewire neural pathways more effectively than occasional intense efforts. You understand that self-compassion and accountability can coexist without contradiction. This knowledge changes nothing until you use it. The ambitious lazy pattern persists not because people lack information, but because they substitute information for action. Reading about discipline feels safer than practicing it. Analyzing your psychology feels productive without requiring you to actually change your behavior. At some point, the analysis must end and the work must begin. The person you want to become is not waiting at the end of some dramatic transformation. They are built gradually through accumulated choices, most of them small, and none of them glamorous. Each day you act despite not feeling ready, you add evidence to a new identity. Each time you begin before conditions are perfect, you weaken the perfectionism that has kept you paralyzed. The ambitious lazy paradox resolves not through revelation but through repetition. You do not need to feel different before you act differently. You act differently until you become different.